Our featured guest tonight has been in and around rock and Americana royalty for most of his life, and by many is considered royalty himself. For his solo projects, to his songwriting and his involvement with some of the most spectacular bands and musicians of American music, including the Greg Allman Band and Little Feat, he has been acclaimed for his skill as both a musician and his sensibilities as an artist. Little Feat will be playing the Sanger Theater in Mobile on March 23rd. Here to talk about his incredible story, his current adventure with Little Feat, their upcoming shows, and many memories in between is the legendary Scott Sharrard. Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that introduction.
Well, I'd like to get to know a little bit more about your story before we get into the kind of the meat of the interview. Where did you grow up and what was life like for you there?
Well, I mean, my recent solo album was called Rust Belt because people ask me where I'm from, and I basically just say the Rust Belt. I'm not trying to be cheeky. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was raised in Dearborn, and then my family moved all over the Midwest, essentially, which included a brief stint in Minnesota, a longer formative few years in Newtown, Pennsylvania, which is right on the edge of the Rust Belt, and then went back for high school, sophomore year of high school, went back and went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then in 1996, I made the move to, coming right out of high school, I made the move to New York City, and I've been here ever since.
I know your dad had a seemingly massive impact on your life path, given he was a musician himself. What did he play, and what would you say was his biggest influence on
Well,
your
he's a
career?
guitarist and singer, and rock and roll Freud would have a field day with my life. The brief version of it is, my father was a singer-songwriter who started with garage rock bands in Michigan in the '60s, and then saw Bob Dylan at Michigan State University play solo doing "Blowin' in the Wind," and decided to sell all his electric instruments and go acoustic. And then he became a folk blues troubadour, essentially. He did the whole path of going to LA and tried to get signed, and the long story short is none of it worked out. And eventually they had me in 1976 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And, basically my dad, especially after they had me, settled into going into first college radio and then eventually cable television, and would support his music habit with his work instead of the other way around. But I grew up going to tons of concerts, and I was in a very artistic leaning family. A lot of books, a lot of plays, a lot of movies, and a lot of really deep music, including a lot of very deep blues and soul and jazz. And then I would say I've always said the Beatles and Rolling Stones of my household were really Little Feat and the Allman Brothers, which is, it's quite insane when you think about the fact that those were the bands who I went to see when I was a kid to experience rock and roll for the first time, and they were the favorite bands of my parents, and I've ended up in these sort of iterations or extended families of both of them.
Yeah, that's just way cool when you have those things and then they just kind of fall into place, and like who would have thought, if you had a time machine, So I've heard that some of your high school for the arts classmates went on to some fantastic careers as well. Who all comes to mind there?
Um, so we had all these amazing musicians who came through the program, like McCoy Tyner and Roy Hargrove, Tito Puente, Jerry Mulligan, and the students at the school all had to audition to get in, and it was very strict, even though it was a public school. It was a very intense program, and my classmates, Sean Hinton, who was a year my junior, he went on to become Mary J. Blige's MD, and he's written a number of popular songs, and he's a phenomenal musician. My friend Katie Foffel, who is a phenomenal singer, she was in Warhorse, Steven Spielberg's production at Lincoln Center, and now she's runs these amazing Broadway vocal instruction and charity operations. My classmate Sean Dixon, who was a year ahead of me, we went on to form a group called the Chesterfields. That was my first band. We came to New York together. Sean since then has worked with a number of great artists like Michelle Ndegeocello and a bunch of great New York-based poets and hip-hop artists. So it's a pretty diverse bunch, but everybody went on to either be a professional musician or a music educator in my class and in the classes behind and ahead of me.
So how did the band, your band, the Chesterfields, come about, and what made you guys decide to jump to New York?
This is something that occurred to me recently, and I'm glad you asked me because it brought this up, the opportunity to talk about this when I was 15. I got fired from this band, the Blues Disciples, because I wasn't an authentic enough blues performer. And the reason I was fired was because I wanted to play Little Feat and Allman Brothers songs. But the irony is when they fired me, I took the two best guys in the band, the drummer and the B3 organ player. This is the early 90s in Milwaukee. I took them with me. And they, as I said, they're both older guys. And we formed a group called the Chesterfield Kings with a bassist named Rick Holmes. So this was like the other laboratory I had besides the school was this nighttime one where I was with all these older cats, and luckily the Mike Costel, the owner of the bar, at 16 I was legally allowed to be an employee there, so he signed me on as a barback. But that got me the green light to go in there anytime I wanted to sit in, to play gigs. And it was on the east side of Milwaukee, 15-20 minute walk from my parents' house.
It's interesting that you kind of stepped into the music business in New York also at the time that you did, because that was, as I recall, that was kind of when the industry was sort of starting to flip on its head a little bit. What are the lessons you learned from those early years in New York and kind of having a front row seat to seeing the industry start to go through some of those changes?
You know, I had some meetings with people like Ahmet Ertegun and Russ Titleman when I first got to town who, you know, when I was 21, they were recognizing my talent. And, you know, Ahmet's the guy who started Atlantic Records. He's the most, arguably the most important record man in history. Being that he had Atlantic and subsidiary being Stax Records and worked with Jerry Wexler and did all the Aretha Franklin, all the, I mean, Allman Brothers, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones. I mean, it's just John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman. I mean, it's like Ray Charles, you know, is how he started. So he gave me some great advice in 2000 when I met with him, or 99, it might have been 99 or 2000. He basically told me, he's like, the whole thing is over. The tastemakers are out. They're suing kids for downloading. Get good at everything. That was his advice to me. And where that's gone is, you know, yes, I had a front row seat, as you said, for the complete decimation of the record business, we'll say. And then I saw the rise of the live music business. And in the live music business, I watched agents and promoters who, with the very rare exceptions, like, let's say, Bill Graham back in the 60s. Every once in a while you get a Bill Graham, but most of these people are like car salesmen. You know, they're not tastemakers. And when live music and rock and roll and roots music superseded the profit margins of the records, people who had no business being tastemakers became them.
And when you refer to tastemakers, for those that don't know, what exactly are who are you calling the tastemakers, and what role did they play in the industry?
What I call sort of the beginning of our rock and roll American roots music renaissance, where the jazz and the blues and the folk and the Appalachian and all the stuff started to merge. And that's where you have, it starts with Sam Phillips at Sun Records, Berry Gordy at Motown, Stax Records in Memphis, and, you know, you have the Seahorn Soul Farm in New Orleans, those early Little Richard records, Chuck Berry in St. Louis, so, and Chess Records, of course, in Chicago. So those were all these family businesses that then got absorbed by conglomerates. Those people, Leonard and Phil Chess, Sam Phillips, Berry Gordy, Marshall Seahorn, these guys were the first tastemakers in record making. And by that, I mean, these are guys who discovered local talent. They shined their local talent in the best light they possibly could, but they kept the realness, the rawness, the creativity. They geared everything towards the art. So when people talk about American music, I talk about the American musical renaissance built around records, which goes from like the 50s till the 80s. And it extends into the 80s, because even in the 80s you had Prince was given full creative control. I mean, there were these unprecedented things happening to us now where it's like, here's a 5-album deal to an unknown artist. Make whatever you like and let's see what happens.